Hey guitar players, Ari Koinuma here, and this is the part 3 of my musical theater gig series. And today we're going to talk about the preparation that I go through before we start rehearsing with the group. So this is where, as a guitar player, we're having to play along with a particular convention that really doesn't come very naturally to us guitar players, and that is the idea of reading the music. Even if you're able to read the music fairly well, even if you can sight read, musical theater score is fairly overwhelming in that there are lots of key changes, there are lots of meter changes, accidentals that come and go, mixture of actual notes versus chord symbols, and other gobbledygook that are unique to notating guitar gestures, whether it's pick slides or slides and bends and things like that, right? And yet, musical theater is very much rooted in the traditional classical music convention in that they assume that musicians show up and learn the music primarily from the score. But we guitar players have a lot to decipher from the score before we show up for the first rehearsal. Things like where are the patch changes, or do you have to change the sound, or do you have to change the instrument between electric and acoustic guitars, right? And then how do you do the page turns, or what positions do you play certain parts in so that they can flow naturally to the next part that comes along, and things like that. So preparation is definitely very important so that you don't show up at the first rehearsal looking completely unable to play, which is not unexpected in that most of the other instruments, they just show up on sight read, so things don't sound great during the first rehearsal. But for us guitar players, at least for myself, if I don't do any preparation, that means I play very few notes on the first rehearsal. Maybe some of the easier chords I can play, but really I wouldn't feel comfortable showing up if I don't have any preparations at all. So I do obviously try to get the score as early as possible and plan on spending some time looking through the score and getting ready for the first pit rehearsal. Which leads to the next point, in that it helps to know generally how musical theater productions are put together. They typically follow the same sequence of steps, and pit is one of the last or later pieces that come into the theater production. So a lot of the preparations have already happened by the time we, the pit musicians, show up. But it helps to know how the process goes. So typically actors start rehearsing weeks, possibly months before the show time, and by the time the pit musicians show up, they are almost at the end of the rehearsal period, and they should know all the songs, and a lot of times they should have memorized the whole thing and stuff like that. For the pit, what I've seen is that it's common for the pit to have maybe 1 to at most 3 rehearsals on their own before we get together with the actors and kind of start putting the whole thing together. Again, musical theater is rooted in the classical tradition, is that they expect the musicians to be able to just sight read off the score, so they don't expect to have a lot of rehearsals just with the pit. I would say the baseline is that if you go through every single song once as a pit, that's kind of the baseline expectation. But just keep in mind, a musical is like about 2 hours long, and an hour and a half to 2 hours of actual music, and we musicians are playing during like the bows and when the audience is leaving and stuff too. So there's just a lot of music to go through. If you're like me and used to playing rock bands and things like that, we are used to playing the same song a number of times before we think it's performance ready. Well, for musical production, you don't get that many times to go through. So again, preparing is key to successful performance. So after the 1 to 3 times of Pete getting together on their own to go through some stuff, and during that which time the music director often tells us, okay, so this part repeats 5 times instead of 3 as written, or this part gets cut, and there are usually some changes to the score that we need to go over. And then after that, sometimes we have what we call Sitzprobe, which is the musical theater tradition of the first time the actors and the pit getting together and running through the musical numbers. Sometimes this is done in sort of a off stage in a room, just in a circle kind of thing, where the actors don't even act or dance or do anything. They just focus on singing through the songs with the pit. Other times it's just a musical number one after another kind of rehearsal. But anyway, the first time the pit and the actors work together on the music is called Sitzprobe, and it's like the first time we all get together, and usually that session is really focused on getting the music together and getting a feel for what it's like for the entire group to play the music together. Now, sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't, and then there are tech rehearsals. So tech rehearsals are usually the final week leading up to the opening show to sort of bring in all the technical and other elements that haven't been in the rehearsal process up till then, in terms of lights and the sounds and then other props and costumes and makeup, and all these things come together, and the pit is part of that sort of period. In that, pit is one of the elements that are brought in at the very end of the preparation to sort of complete the show's production, right? So during the tech rehearsal, it's an intense time, and it could be a very late night, and even the pit musicians, we may sit around a long time because they were trying to figure out what's wrong with the lights, or what's wrong with the actors' mics, or the pit can't hear the actors because the monitoring isn't quite set up, and all these technical elements get figured out during the tech rehearsal. But it's a very important period in the show, obviously, and that this is a time when the pit does get a few run-throughs of the songs. So again, by this time you should know what you're playing, so you can focus on playing with the ensemble and playing with the actors, and that's when the show really kind of come together. And often it can get kind of hairy. It's part of the fun and challenge of being in theater, is that there are a lot of things that have to come together at the same time, and things don't always come together, and you want to be patient, you want to be open-minded and just go with whatever is needed. The volume of the pit, how loud we can play, how we hear each other, is figured out during the tech week too. So until that gets figured out and dialed in, you might not feel super comfortable playing the pit, but hopefully you figure all that stuff out during the tech week. By the time you start getting together with the group, you really don't have that many times to run through the songs, and so you really need to do your homework and figure out how you're going to play that music before you get to the point, and then refine that understanding as you're going through the show a few times during the pit rehearsals, Sitzprobe, and then tech rehearsals. And here is one important point that I figured out over the course of a few shows, and that is that score is not a mandate for you to play every single thing that is written on there as written. Think of the score as a document that contains everything that could be played. And it's up to you as the guitar player to figure out what you're gonna play out of all the possible things that you could play. In the beginning, I used to feel bad that like I couldn't play everything that was written, but after a while I started realizing that's not the expectation, and that the expectation is that you simplify the score into the parts that you can play, and you can play well, you can play in time, you can play with the right dynamics and in synchronization with the other parts. That's more important than playing everything as written. So I've learned to be fairly ruthless in terms of cutting out parts that are not needed, cutting out notes that are not needed. And one of the things that it still really bugs me to this day, that the musical theater industry doesn't do very great, well, they do a great disservice in a way, is that when whoever is preparing the score, when they're putting the chord charts together, they think that like if the chord chart needs to represent every single note that, every single instrument in the pit ever plays at that moment, and call it the chord. And so the chord symbols can look really scary at first. It could have lots of more complicated jazz harmonies and slash chords with different bass notes that aren't in the chord, and 11ths and 13ths and flat fifths and sharp fifths, and it can be really overwhelming if you think, oh, I have to play this, flat 13 sharp 5 chord here, and then right after that it goes into sharp 11 chord right after that. No, no. You don't have to play those chords. You have to pick out some notes in that chord that seem important and that you can play, and stick to that. And it's more important for you to be able to play in time, play well, than to play all the notes. There have been some challenging songs that I played in where it's a really fast jazzy passage where I didn't play the chords at all. I just picked out a note out of every single chord and just played a single note line. That's better than trying to stumble through some complex chords and then not being able to execute it well. And in the spirit, it really helps to know that there are fundamentally 4 types of chords, right? There's the major, there's the minor, there's the diminished, there's the augmented. And the last 2 show up less often, right? And then if you can't figure out what they are, you can kind of skip some of the notes and then just know that you can just stick to the notes that you know are in those chords, and then just not worry about whether it's diminished or augmented or whatever. You can just skip to like the root of the chord and then just be done with it. That being said, in all the musicals I played, there are always some featured guitar parts that you do want to pay attention to and you do want to do justice to. A lot of times it's the lead melody that the guitar is given, or opening riff to a particular song that kickstart a particular number, right? Those are important moments where the guitar plays a critical role, and you do want to identify those and then have them under your fingers so that you can confidently play those parts when the time comes for it. So here's a page from a recent show that I played. I bastardized the copy that I got, so I just kept this page here. But what happened here is that there are 2 guitar parts, but then for budgetary and other reasons, I was the only guitar player. Now, a lot of modern Broadway musical scores do have more than 1 guitar parts, and they fall in 1 or 2 schools of thought. One is that the people who are arrangers realized that a lot of the productions will only have one guitar, so guitar 1 has all the important parts and guitar 2 has the nice to have optional parts, and that's a little simpler to deal with. In this show's case, the arranger did the conscientious thing of giving guitar 2 some juicy parts to play as well, and that meant that when I studied the guitar 1 part, the music didn't sound right? Because there are some important parts that are given to guitar 2, and then so I asked for the guitar 2 score, and then I ended up doing a IRL copy and paste between different scores, and then just figuring out, okay, so which are the sort of the important parts between the two guitar scores, and then combine them so that I could serve the music the best I can. Single guitar player covering two guitar player parts. That's not often necessary, but I'm just sharing that with you to kind of see the level of preparation that you might have to do to do justice to the parts you're given in a musical theater. I also want to touch on the debate of analog versus digital as far as the score. In all the shows I played so far, the physical paper score was available, although there were some shows where I did play on 4Score app on my iPad, which is seems to be the industry standard at this point. Whether you do the tablet or the paper is kind of a toss-up in that there are pros and cons to each. The digital's advantage, in my mind, is that if you have a stylus and you make notes, you are just making your own notes. You're not like making marks on these copies that you'll have to eventually erase and return at the end of the show. And that if you invest in a Bluetooth page turner pedals, then you can sort of turn pages without actually taking your hands off of the instrument. You don't need a separate stage light because your tablet is lit, obviously. Obviously, you probably keep track of your iPad better than perhaps some borrowed score, so you may have less chance of forgetting your score at home doing important rehearsals or shows or something like that. But unless you already have an iPad and stylus, it's quite a bit of investment to invest in a tablet setup, and good old paper score work just as well. Page turn is an issue, but you could perhaps make copies so that you can spread more than multiple pages on a single at a time, so that you have less page turns. In the case like I had where I combined two scores, being able to physically copy and paste different passages is a little easier on paper. In the digital, you have to break up one large PDF that has 20 plus songs and then organize them into a set list, but in a traditional book that's already done for you, right? So it's a bit of a toss-up. I wouldn't go out and invest in an iPad setup unless you really feel that that suits your style and that this is something that you do on a semi-regular basis. Okay, that's it for the preparation for musical theater gigs. Next, I'm going to talk about what it's like to actually perform those shows. Talk to you then.